In 1846, a wagon train crosses the Kansas prairie. A preacher rides at the front. In his saddlebag, a Bible, a rifle, and a deed to land that was never his to claim. He believes God gave him this land. He believes it is his destiny. He is not alone. Millions like him will cross this continent in the next 50 years, and almost all of them will believe the same thing: that a divine hand guided their wagons west, that the wilderness was empty and waiting, that the people already living on it were obstacles to be moved, converted, or erased. This is the story of that belief. Not just a slogan, not just a painting of a woman in white robes floating over the plains with a school book in one hand, but an entire theology of conquest. A doctrine that turned land theft into a sacrament and mass killing into a mission from God. This is the story of manifest destiny, and it is the story of a genocide that most Americans were never taught to call by its name. The phrase itself is younger than you'd think. It was coined in July 1845 by a New York newspaper editor named John L. O'Sullivan, arguing that the United States had the right to annex Texas. He wrote that it was the nation's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. Providence, not conquest, not ambition. Providence, God's own plan, made visible. But O'Sullivan didn't invent the idea, he just gave it a name. The theology beneath it was 200 years old, carried across the Atlantic by the first English Puritan. John Winthrop stood on the deck of a ship in 1630 and told his fellow colonists they would build a city upon a hill, a new Israel, a chosen people planted by God in a promised land. There was only one problem with that story. The land already had people on it, so the theology had to solve that problem too. European legal and religious tradition had an answer ready-made: the doctrine of discovery, a set of 15th century papal decrees that declared non-Christian lands open for Christian conquest. Under this doctrine, indigenous nations weren't sovereign owners of their homelands. They were, in the eyes of European and later American law, occupants without title, placeholders waiting to be replaced. By the time O'Sullivan put a name to it, the idea had fused three things into one unbreakable logic: Christian mission, racial hierarchy, and national expansion. Americans weren't just taking land, they were fulfilling scripture. And if the people in the way of that scripture suffered or starved or died, that wasn't a crime. In the language of the era, it was simply the working of providence. That word, providence, is going to matter for the rest of this film, because everything that follows, every act of removal, every massacre, every stolen child, was justified by someone, somewhere, as the will of God. Ideas don't move armies. Laws do. And in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the law that turned manifest destiny from a sermon into a policy, the Indian Removal Act. The act authorized the federal government to negotiate, and when negotiation failed, to force the relocation of native nations east of the Mississippi to territory in the West. Jackson framed it in the language of paternal care, calling it a policy of protection and even kindness. The reality was mass expulsion at gunpoint. The Cherokee Nation fought the policy in court and won. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, affirming their status as a sovereign nation with a right to their land. Jackson is said to have ignored the ruling outright, and in 1838, the U.S. Army marched roughly 16,000 Cherokee people out of their homeland on what would become known as the Trail of Tears. Historians estimate around 4,000 died of cold, disease, and starvation along the way, a story so significant it deserves and has received its own full documentary. Tonight we're widening the lens because the Cherokee removal wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the opening move in a continental campaign that would repeat itself with variations for the next 60 years, in Florida against the Seminole, in the Old Northwest against the Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk, and eventually across the entire western half of the continent. Each removal followed the same script. First, a treaty, often signed under duress, sometimes by leaders with no authority to sign it at all. Then, when the treaty inevitably failed to satisfy settlers hungry for more land, violation blamed on the native nation itself. Then troops, then march. And running underneath every one of these campaigns was the same theological current. This land was promised. These people are in the way of the promise. Move them or remove them. Nowhere does that current run darker than in California, in the years after the gold rush, a chapter of American history so brutal that modern state government has, in official documents, used the word genocide to describe it. Before 1848, California was home to an estimated 150,000 indigenous people. Within just over 2 decades, that population had collapsed to under 30,000. This wasn't primarily disease, though disease played a role. It was policy. California's first American governor, Peter Burnett, told the state legislature in 1851
against this encroachment on liberty,
that a war of extermination would continue between the races until the native population was extinct. And he said this not as a warning, but as an expectation he considered natural and unavoidable. The state legislature responded not with horror, but with funding. It authorized and reimbursed local militias for campaigns against native villages, effectively putting a bounty system into practice. Men were paid for the scalps and severed heads of native men, women, and children. Local newspapers advertised these campaigns as public service. Boys as young as 8 and girls as young as 10 were kidnapped and sold into forced indentured servitude under California's own Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, a law whose title borrowed the language of protection to legalize the opposite. This was not a rogue militia acting alone. This was elected government, funded by state and federal treasuries, executing a policy that 21st century state investigations would formally define as genocide under international legal standards. It happened in the same decades that Easterners were reading uplifting sermons about a young nation's God-given mission to civilize a continent. Move the timeline forward to a cold November morning in 1864. Southeastern Colorado Territory. A peaceful encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho people flies both a white flag of truce and an American flag over their lodges, flags they had specifically been told would guarantee their safety. At dawn, Colonel John Chivington leads roughly 675 U.S. volunteer cavalry troops in an attack on the camp. Most of the men of fighting age are away hunting. The people in the camp are overwhelmingly women, children, and the elderly. What followed was not a battle. Survivors and later congressional investigators described the deliberate killing of non-combatants, the mutilation of bodies and body parts carried back to Denver as trophies, displayed on a theater stage to a cheering audience. Estimates of the dead range from around 150 to over 230 people. When some of his own officers protested the order to attack,
"We gathered vital intelligence, sir. The fog bank proved that. Your recklessness will be noted."
Chivington is recorded as having argued that killing native children was justified because, in his words, nits make lice. The idea that even the youngest members of a people were future threats to be eliminated. That phrase has survived in the historical record precisely because it says the quiet part out loud. This wasn't about self-defense. It was about erasure. A joint congressional committee condemned the massacre. Chivington was never criminally charged, and in the towns that celebrated his return, the massacre was, for a time, remembered as a victory. 1,500 miles southwest, the Diné, the Navajo people, faced their own campaign of forced removal in 1864 in what is remembered as the Long Walk. Under orders from General James Carleton and executed by the frontier soldier Kit Carson, U.S. forces waged a scorched earth campaign across Navajo territory, burning crops, destroying orchards, killing livestock, designed not to defeat an army but to starve an entire people into surrender. Roughly 8,000 to 10,000 Navajo people were then forced to walk over 300 miles to a desolate internment camp at Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. Hundreds died along the route from exposure, exhaustion, and violence. Conditions at Bosque Redondo were catastrophic. Crop failures, contaminated water, and disease killed thousands more during 4 years of confinement. The stated purpose of the camp, in the language of the era, was to civilize and Christianize the Navajo people by concentrating them under military and religious supervision. In practice, it was a death camp disguised as a mission. It took a treaty in 1868 and the collapse of the camp's own logistics before survivors were finally permitted to return to a fraction of their homeland. By the 1870s, the open military campaigns were winding down, not because the ideology behind them had changed, but because a new strategy had emerged, one aimed not at land, but at identity itself. In 1879, U.S. Army officer Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. In a speech delivered years later in 1892, Pratt would state the school's founding philosophy plainly: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Over the following decades, tens of thousands of Native children across the United States were removed from their families, often forcibly, sometimes under threat of arrest to the parents who refused, and sent to boarding schools, many run by Christian churches under federal contract. Children had their hair cut, their names replaced with English ones, and were punished often violently for speaking their own languages. Malnutrition, disease, and abuse were widespread. In 2022, a U.S. Department of the Interior investigation identified over 500 recorded deaths at these schools, and investigators were clear that the true number is almost certainly far higher, since many school cemeteries were never properly documented. This was not incidental cruelty. It was policy, designed explicitly to sever a generation of children from their language, their religion, and their families. An act that international law, defined decades later, would recognize as one of the core components of genocide: the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. Here we have to pause on a word, because historians, legal scholars, and indigenous nations themselves don't all agree on how to use it. The word genocide was coined by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944, and formally defined by the United Nations in 1948, to include acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, including killing, causing serious harm, imposing conditions calculated to destroy the group, and forcibly transferring children. Some historians argue that the pattern across 2.5 centuries of American expansion, the massacres, the bounty systems, the forced marches, the removal of children, meets this definition directly and should be named as such without hedging. Others, while agreeing on nearly every historical fact, argue for more precise terms case by case, some episodes as genocide, some as ethnic cleansing, some as war crimes, cautioning that flattening centuries of varied policy into a single word can obscure important differences in intent and mechanism between, say, California's extermination campaigns and the assimilationist violence of the boarding schools. What is not seriously disputed across historians of any school is the scale of the death toll, the participation of official U.S. and state governments, and the use of religious and providential language to justify it at the time. Whatever term one settles on, the historical record itself is not in question. The population collapse this policy produced is almost unimaginable in scale. Some scholarly estimates place the indigenous population of North America before European contact in the millions to tens of millions. By the early 20th century, U.S. Census figures counted a few 100,000 native people remaining within the country's borders, a demographic collapse driven by disease, displacement, warfare, and policy compounding across 4 centuries. But this is not only a story of the past tense. Native nations survived, and in the last 50 years have driven a resurgence. Language revitalization programs bringing indigenous languages back from the edge of extinction.
The amazing thing you've ever seen.
Tribal sovereignty rebuilt through decades of legal battles, and land returned through the growing Land Back movement, in which tribes and allied organizations have reacquired millions of acres. In 2000, the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs issued a formal apology for the agency's historical role in these policies. In 2022, the Department of the Interior formally acknowledged the federal boarding school system's harms in an official report. These are recent admissions. Most Americans alive today are older than the first time their own government used the word genocide in connection with any part of this history. The wagon train we opened with kept moving west. It reached its destination. The preacher believed until the day he died that God had cleared the way for him. He was never taught to see what he was part of, and for most of American history, neither were the generations that came after him. This isn't a story told to generate guilt. It's told because a nation that cannot look honestly at how it was built cannot fully understand what it has inherited: the land, the wealth, and the dead. The indigenous nations of this continent are still here. Their story did not end at Wounded Knee, or Bosque Redondo, or Sand Creek. It continues today in courtrooms, in classrooms, in language nests teaching toddlers words that were nearly erased on purpose. This has been Unfinished History USA. If this story is new to you, it was never supposed to stay hidden. Subscribe, and we'll keep digging up the history that was buried on purpose.